And let's get into this now, because this last one, transferring risk, sometimes people have a hard time understanding this one. And so we created a graphic for it. So we have the project scope and the vendor. How much risk should a vendor have within the project scope? Close to zero. You're right, Felipe. Close to zero. So the vendor, within their project scope, they are an expert. They can see this thing simple. They can see it from beginning to end. They cause practically no risk. So we're just going to say zero risk. So who is the greatest source of project risk? The buyer. And if you're a buyer, please don't take offense to this. It is the reality of it, though. And if you are a buyer, you should know that you're the biggest risk. The greatest source of risk are the non-expert client stakeholders, because they're non-experts in the area. Design errors, changing the requirement, unknown conditions, all these things, or missed calculations or estimates being told, they're what cause the majority of risk on a project. Now, what normally happens here is the buyer will try to transfer this risk to the vendor and have them responsible for it. Is it possible to transfer risk to the vendor? And a lot of times this is done through a contract. And so they feel if the vendor signs it, it's in paper, then they can transfer the risk. But what ends up happening is all that goes on here is the vendor can't take accountability for risks they do not cause. And so what they end up doing is they just add contingency to the project. So they don't mitigate it. They just add a cost to it and estimate how much the client will try to charge them. Now, what's wrong with this? If the risk doesn't happen and the cost doesn't happen, now the buyer has paid more for what they shouldn't have, for something that didn't even happen. If the vendor underestimates and the risk actually costs more than they amounted for contingency, what will they do? Well, let's just do a change order and the client will have to pay for it anyways. All the while, the cost here isn't going away. No matter what the client thinks they're doing, the cost isn't going away. And nobody now is mitigating the risk, because the bigger contingency a vendor has, do you think that vendor's plan and tracking that plan is going to be more accurate or less accurate? Less accurate. Because they have this contingency. Anytime something happens, they'll just say, oh, just use the contingency. And no one will care about the project time or cost until you run out of money or run out of time. And then that's how we get into litigation, when everyone's trying to blame somebody else. No, transferring risk doesn't work. The only way to solve this is we want transparency, meaning we want the person that causes risk to pay for the risk. So the vendor in best value is not financially responsible for risk they don't control. The client is responsible for that. The vendor is responsible for risk mitigation. So planning and tracking the project and providing this transparency. All contingency does is it will inflate the cost, and so the client now doesn't actually know the true cost, and now it's more difficult to distinguish who is the expert, because now you get the idea that experts cost more, which they don't. And the last idea I want to hit on here is contracts and minimum standards. So how much power now, after kind of going over an example of this, how much power does a contract have? If you were to bet, if you want to increase performance, is it a good idea to use a contract to guarantee that performance? Now, I just presented to a chapter of the National Contracting Managing Association. I think that's what they're called. And I asked them the same question, and they felt it had a lot of control, a lot of power over the vendor. And so I asked them a simple question. Have you ever seen a contract say you can be over budget or over cost? The answer is clearly no. But yet we have so much of that going on in the industry. That is just a simple example of how much control a contract has, which is zero. Because anytime you actually have to use a contract, both sides will lose. Anytime you have to get that contract out in the middle of a project and start reading it to figure out if you can force somebody to do something, you already know the project is at risk. The best contract, we always say, is a contract you sign, you put in a drawer, and you never use ever again. Because it's actually an illusion of control.
If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to our channel for more content. If you have any questions about the best value approach or for Dr. Dean, leave them in the comment section below and we'll get to them in a later video. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.